Hello, so this Science of Sport short video covers content from BTEC Sport and Exercise Sciences, Unit 2 Functional Anatomy. And we specifically will be looking at the skeletal system and an element of that, or topic of that, D1, anatomy of a bone. I'm actually going to divide this into two short videos. Part one, this video, will cover the anatomy of a bone, and it specifies actually a long bone. So you may need to be able to describe or explain the structure of this long bone. And these on the left-hand side are the anatomical features that you might need to account for. So exam questions might say, describe the function of the periosteum, or describe the role of the periosteum, or bone marrow, or what is cancellous bone. The second video will look at these bony landmarks, and we'll get to that later. So this is an unlabeled diagram of a long bone, and this is the sort of image that you might get, probably a little bit more black and white and simplified perhaps, but you will see, and we will go through in this video, some of the characteristics of the anatomy of this type of bone. You may recognize different types of bone tissue, the vessels, this sort of material that is in the central hollow part of the bone. But I'm going to show you a very short video that goes through many aspects of long bone anatomy.
Hey guys, in this lesson I'm going to be teaching you about the gross anatomy of a bone, including all the standard structures you'll find with a brief explanation of their function. So bone gross anatomy. And the first thing to point out is that bones are made up of several different tissue types, which would classify them as an organ, as we learned in the levels of structural organization video. So they're classified as organs because they have several tissue types. Starting with the overall appearance of a bone, we're going to notice here that we've got one end up the top, a long thin portion in the middle, and a stumpy kind of end at the bottom as well, and this is a long bone. So we've got the top, the middle, and the base, and these all have specific names. Now the top portion here is what we call the proximal epiphysis. Now it's called the proximal epiphysis because it's closest to the attachment point of the trunk. At the other end we have the distal epiphysis, and they are named relative to their position, and we'll start to make a habit from now on of using the correct directional terms so we can get used to it. I'll just point out that also it's going to be helpful to know that this bone is the humerus, which is the bone in the upper half of your arm. So the proximal is going to be at the shoulder end, and the distal end of the bone is going to be down towards your elbow, leading towards your hand. Now, our epiphyses are going to contain a unique type of bone called spongy bone. You might also hear it called woven or cancellous bone, and they are going to be the interaction points for where the bone meets the surface of another bone. Now, this leads to that area needing to have some form of protection for movement and for resisting shock, and that comes in the form of hyaline cartilage or articular cartilage that we've spoken about before. But what about this middle portion of the bone we see over here? Well, that's going to be known as the diaphysis. The diaphysis is the long axis of the bone, and it's going to have a central cavity within it. Because the diaphysis is much thinner than the epiphyses, it's also going to be needed to be made out of something much stronger, and that's called compact bone. The compact bone has a much denser structure and can support more weight than the woven bone. So we have learned so far that we have the two ends of the bone and a middle, but there is even going to be a name for this portion that separates the two, and it's called an epiphyseal plate. despite its small size, it actually has a very important function. The epiphyseal plate is going to be made out of a disc of hyaline cartilage that will constantly grow and push new chondrocytes down into the diaphysis, where they will aid in the growth and elongation of the bones. So it's pushing it down toward the diaphyses. And that's going to be happening at the distal epiphysis as well. That same thing will be happening at that plate. It is not until early adulthood where these plates will fuse and transform into bone themselves, thus controlling the height at which we will reach in our lifetime. So fuses in adulthood. Now the next thing I'm going to outline here is what we call the periosteum. Now the periosteum is a membrane covering that goes all around the bone. And actually the only part of the bone that isn't covered in this periosteum are the articular cartilage points at the ends. So it's a membrane that's going to go all the way around the bone, covers the whole bone. So I'll just color in that section of the bone there so you can see that it's going all the way around. But we have another type of fiber in here that's going to be attaching that membrane onto the bone surface. And we call those fibers Sharpie's fibers or perforating fibers. The perforating fibers are going to connect the periosteum to the bone, and they're made out of very strong collagen fiber. So we've got those two layers of periosteum and perforating fibers, and they're both types of connective tissue. So let's quickly recap what we've learned so far. We've learned that there are two ends of the bone called the epiphyses. There's a middle portion called the diaphysis. It's going to have a central cavity. And there's going to be those epiphyseal plates where the growth and elongation is going to happen. But from there, what's our next kind of thing? Well, like I said, that bone is an organ, so we're going to need to keep it alive and keep the cells in the bone alive as well. And we do that with nutrient arteries. So those arteries that are going to be going into the bone and perforating the surface of the bone are going to be delivering blood to the bone so you can grow new tissue and store nutrients. And as I highlighted when we spoke about the diaphysis, I'll just quickly write in here and show you a close-up of the compact bone. The compact bone is much denser, as I said before, and it's going to be made out of long units of bone called osteons, or Haversian systems. And the Haversian systems are quite complex, and we'll talk about the Haversian system in a later video. So it's made out of osteons, and you can see them, I'm just circling them here. Long units that stretch along the length of the bone. So they're your osteons. So I've said that we have this middle portion that's a central cavity in the diaphysis. And I'm just outlining this structure that we see in the middle here because it's going to be the next thing that we'll look at. There's absolutely no point in having empty space in the body, so we use those central cavities of the bone to store yellow bone marrow. Yellow bone marrow is mostly just fat tissue, so it's stored nutrients. There we go, so stores of fat. And another name for that central cavity is the medullary cavity. So if you hear the term medullary cavity, they're talking about that space in between the diaphyses of our long bones. And just the last thing I will highlight here on the central portion of our long bone within the diaphysis is what we call the endosteum. So we've got the periosteum on the outside, which is that membrane, and the inner surface is called the endosteum. Now it doesn't have a membrane there, but we just call it the endosteum, so we know that's the name for the surface area of that inner cavity. Okay, we're getting very close to the end now. One of the last things I'll highlight up here is the fact that I spoke about spongy bone earlier, but I didn't really point it out. So we've got the spongy bone, and it looks like it's woven all together, so that's why you'll see it called woven bone as well. So it's loosely connected bone tissue, but it's still also quite strong. And it's going to be one of the main sites of hematopoiesis. And hematopoiesis is where we grow and develop and mature our blood cells. So that's going to be happening in those end epiphyses of the long bones. Within that spongy bone, we can see all these holes. It's all woven together with empty spaces all throughout. We call those thin filaments of the bone that line this area the trabeculae. So we'll write that down here. Trabeculae. Now, in between those spaces of the trabeculae is going to be the area where we keep that red bone marrow, which will be the site of hematopoiesis. So we have the yellow bone marrow storing our fat tissue in the medullary cavity, and our red bone marrow having a role in proliferation of new blood cells. Now, before I get too far ahead of myself, I'll just point out that down the bottom here, we can see that articular cartilage on the end of the bone, and also on the top of the bone. I'll just highlight here too.
So that video went into great detail and incorporated all of these components that you might need to answer in a question. Again, here's another version of a diagram, which is worth spending a moment or two just looking through label by label. This anatomical description or directional term, proximal, distal, again, really important for you to start using as we go through this. So distal is further away, proximal is nearer the connection to the body. So in his example in the video, if this was the humerus in the upper arm, the shoulder would be up here and your hand would be down here. Take time also to recognize the different types of bone tissue. So we've got compact bone tissue wrapping around the strong length of the bone, the diaphysis. We've got spongy bone tissue, which you can see at the epiphyses at the ends of the bones. Here, this network of trabeculae, the bone tissue here, it's got holes in it basically to keep it very light, but it is immensely strong. And the gaps inside the trabeculae are filled with red bone marrow. And the red bone marrow is central to hematopoiesis, or the production of red blood cells, really important for oxygen transport. I think diagrams are really important, but it's actually quite valuable sometimes to see a more real version. So here is looks like a femur and a pelvic bone. This is the socket and this is the ball. And you can see this network of trabeculae, this spongy bone tissue, and you can see the tough outer layer of compact bone tissue here. It's quite different in substance. Again, just focusing on the different types of bone tissue. So here's our specific example of cancellous or spongy bone tissue. Just be mindful that they mean the same thing, spongy and cancellous bone tissue. And we've got this network of trabeculae, which give an awful lot of strength to the bone, but keep it light. If we had solid bone up here, each individual bone would be much heavier and our skeleton would be much heavier, and it's quite impractical. So this network of almost honeycomb-like trabeculae gives us strength, maintaining lightness. And then again, the compact bone tissue, which is made up of osteons, these circular long shafts of bone, really strong, incredibly strong end to end. So if this was a long bone, we can absorb a lot of shock through the length of our bone. Where our long bones are vulnerable is any impact from the side. So if there was any impact, if you think of a femur or a tibia and there's a bad tackle that comes from the side, that's where we're vulnerable to the bones breaking. But lengthwise, they're incredibly strong. So just to illustrate a possible type of exam question you might get, we've got a two-part question here worth 6 marks in total. So always check out the marks available, always recognise how many parts there are to a question and read every question carefully. So you have to identify which letters in figure 2 show the location of the cancellous bone, periosteum and growth plate. So this is purely associated with labeling the diagram. Second part of the question then says describe the function of the growth plate. So not just where is it, but it wants to know what the role of the growth plates are. So 6 marks in total. Given it's asking you for 3 locations, that would be worth 3 marks, which means that the second part of the question is also worth 3 marks. So what we've got here is some student answers to that same question. Again, the first part of the question, part A, was labelling the bone. So you can see that cancellous bone was B. It's this spongy bone tissue in the epiphysis. The periosteum is E. It's the outer protective tough layer of the bone. And C illustrates where growth plates are. So there's one this end, there's actually one that end as well. So all you had to do was identify, and in this case you had to write a letter. The second part of the question, for 3 marks also, was to describe the function of the growth plates. Now I've got multiple answers here. This answer is worth 2 marks, 2 marks, 1 mark, and no marks. What I'd like you to do is take your time and pause the video and read through each answer. I know some of the writing is a little bit difficult in places to read, but take in what the answers were and what marks were gained from. Now what I just wanted to show you at this point is I've got this down in the notes in my PowerPoint, and this is available in all of my work PowerPoints, but this information was grabbed from the examiner's reports. Now this is feedback given from the people who set the exam questions and who devise the mark scheme for the exam questions and look at a lot of the responses students give. So they give general feedback, they acknowledge where marks were gained, and they acknowledge where weaknesses were, so what people didn't do, what students didn't do. This is, really, really valuable information and absolutely worth you having a read through. It doesn't take long, but if you connect that with the answers given and the mark scheme, you've got a really good sense of what the examiners wanted from an answer. So importantly, here's our exam question, and this is the mark scheme provided by the exam board. So we know already our letters identified the 3 locations or anatomical features of a long bone. And the second part was looking for, so the function of a growth plate, it's where bones increase in length. So we've got growth plates or epiphyseal plates at both ends. They divide the diaphysis, the length of the bone, with the sort of knobbly end parts of the bone, the epiphysis. It's where the process of ossification occurs. So this is where osteoblasts lay down new bone cell. Osteoclasts clear away old bone tissue, and osteoblasts lay down new bone cell, and it hardens. That's ossification. And we also know that as a young adult, these epiphyseal plates or growth plates will harden themselves. They will ossify. They will no longer be an active bone-making location. And that's where you cannot build any further new bone. You will not grow taller. Your long bones will not lengthen any further. Okay, so to get your 3 marks, those were the main points that really you should have had, although sometimes the examiners acknowledge that you may have slightly different points or variations on this, and they're happy within reason to credit this. So lastly then, just to summarise, and again it's worth you stopping the video and having a read through this more closely, this is a summary of the structure of long bones. So these are the key components that you will need to know about. I've tried to divide the anatomical features into structural descriptions and functional descriptions. What's it built like and what job does it do? And again, worth you investing time to get your head around these, test yourself on these.